All right, so we will get on with tonight's presentation, and I appreciate you all coming, especially a little bit late this week. Today, we are going to talk about the Breeding Bird Atlas, which is the reason, or at least the funding behind this whole webinar series. So we're excited to tell you a little bit more about it because I think for the past 10 weeks, we've been saying that we will. First, I'll go through the usual preamble. As I'm sure all of you know by now, Birds Canada is Canada's voice for birds and the leading science-based bird conservation organization in the country. So our mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. And we do that mainly through citizen science volunteers. And the program that we're talking about tonight is a huge citizen science effort. So it is one that we very much need volunteers for. And it really blows my mind every time I read that our programs annually engage more than 70,000 volunteers nationwide. So that's a pretty significant chunk of Canadians. Here in Newfoundland, we have two programs. The first, of course, is the star of tonight's show, the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. But before I talk about that, I'm also just going to mention the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey. And my reason for mentioning that is that that is happening right now. So it takes place between April 1st and May 15th each year. It's another citizen science project. It's a long-term data survey. And basically volunteers drive a route of 10 stops, just one night between April 1st and May 15th, and use a track that combines owl calls and silent listening periods to see if we can prompt some responses from owls, and they record everything they see and hear. The Nocturnal Owl Survey is great if you're a beginning birder, because we really don't have that many species of nocturnal owls here in Newfoundland. We're really only listening for 3, so it's easy to learn what you need to know. It's a fun night out. I love the owl survey. You can bring some hot chocolate. You can take your kids out and do it if you don't mind having a late night for them, and it's a lot of fun. So this is an out-of-date map of our owl survey routes. There are some more now, but you'll notice the Avalon is pretty full. So we are still looking for volunteers. Particularly, we have a couple of off-road routes in Grand Falls, Windsor, 2 off-road routes, and 1 very nice on-road route in Corner Brook, and a few routes near Gander that we're looking to get filled. So if you happen to live in any of those areas and you're interested in participating, please get in touch with me as soon as possible, and we'll see if we can find a route for you. And we're also always looking to establish new routes. So if you happen to live in one of those areas that's a gigantic hole in our coverage, like the Babe Ruth Peninsula, the Northern Peninsula, or, you know, all of South Central Newfoundland, then please feel free to get in touch with me as well, and we can maybe set up a new route. So that's all about the OWL survey for tonight. And I'll just thank all of our partners and funders. So as you'll hear tonight, the Atlas is a pretty huge effort, and we really wouldn't be able to do it without all of these supporters who have provided logistical aid, financial aid, in-kind equipment loans, that kind of thing. And we really appreciate everything they do. And then finally, the land acknowledgement. So the lands where we are conducting the Breeding Bird Atlas are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk people who have been erased forever. Additionally, the island of Newfoundland is the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq people who have been protecting and stewarding the land here since time immemorial. So through our work with the Breeding Bird Atlas and the Nocturnal Owl Survey, we hope to contribute to the stewardship and the effort to protect all the species that we share this island with. Okay, so I always start talks about the Newfoundland Atlas with a little story about this species, and I'm curious, can anyone tell me what it is if you've been attending the webinars so far? So answers in the chat if you know what this guy is. Guesses? Thoughts? Nothing in the chat yet? I'll take even the group. What kind of bird is it? Okay, we've got a wood thrush, we've got a sparrow, we've got a thrush. Any other guesses? Veery, okay, yep, so another thrush. Okay, so I can definitely see, and I've got a vireo, all right. So I can definitely see where you would get a sparrow from, because it is a little brown, kind of nondescript bird. But remember, sparrows have much bigger conical bills. They tend to crush seeds, and they tend to be sort of stockier and more compact. This is a long, lanky guy. So this is in fact a thrush. It's not an American pipit, but good guess. Yep. So this actually is the gray-cheeked thrush. So this is the bird that Gemma here is an expert in. And so you guys may remember this if you were at last week's or 2 weeks ago, the webinar on species at risk. So gray-cheeked thrush are distributed across North America, but our subspecies here in Newfoundland is genetically distinct. So you don't really need to interpret this figure except to know that these little circles are genotypes, and you can see that the birds found in Newfoundland have a totally different genotype. So because it's a unique subspecies, in 2005, Canadian Wildlife Service asked biologist Derek Whitaker to formally evaluate the population status of this subspecies in particular, because they were hearing from birders that they were seeing many fewer individuals of a species that used to be common. And so they wanted to know, were gray-cheeked thrush doing okay, or were they declining? And so Derek took this on in 2005, and he thought it would be not too difficult, but he was wrong. So what he had to work with was breeding bird survey data from the late 1970s and early 1980s. And breeding bird surveys are not like breeding bird atlases. So they're done every year, and they're a little bit like the owl survey because volunteers will drive a route with 50 stops and record all the birds they hear and see at each stop. And they do this only one day in the summer. So if they're done consistently, they should provide a consistent record of how birds are doing. And in the 1970s and early 80s, Derek found that gray-cheeked thrush were actually relatively widespread and abundant. But breeding bird surveys pretty much stopped in Newfoundland after 1984, which meant it was pretty much impossible to determine whether what they were hearing from birders, which was anecdotally, they were saying, oh, we're not hearing as many gray-cheeked thrush, but we had no actual data to assess what was going on with them now. So in the end, when Derek turned in this evaluation, the population status, he said that they were probably declining, but we didn't really have enough information to tell. But then in the early 2000s, the Canadian Wildlife Service really worked hard to restart the breeding birds survey here in Newfoundland. And so Derek asked to redo the analysis in 2010 using data from these new surveys. And you can see a really dramatic decline in populations of gray-cheeked thrush there. So what he found is that the population had declined almost 95% in coastal parts of Newfoundland over a 40-year span. So he had the original data, he had the new data, and he saw that really dramatic decline. And this ended up with the species being, the subspecies being listed as threatened under the Provincial Endangered Species Act. And currently, the Federal Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada is considering listing them under our National Species at Risk Act as well. So I like to start talks with this story, as I said, and it's obviously not a great story for the gray-cheeked thrush, but it does really give a good example of why we need solid baseline data on bird populations and continued monitoring on bird populations. So both of those are necessary. Otherwise, we really can't know what we're losing if we don't know what's out there, and we can't know how it's doing if we're not keeping track. And unfortunately, here in Newfoundland, a lot of those baseline data are missing, and the regular monitoring programs are also a challenge. And this is where breeding bird atlases come in. So as I said, you guys have heard us talking about breeding bird atlases for quite a while now. This is the official definition of breeding bird atlas. It's a comprehensive, systematic assessment of the distribution and abundance of breeding bird species in a jurisdiction over a 5-year period. Here in Canada, the jurisdiction is often a province, but not always. So the Maritimes Atlas, which you can see on the right there, that was for 3 provinces. Here in Newfoundland, we are only doing the island of Newfoundland right now, so Labrador is not included. And the Quebec Atlas only covers southern Quebec right now. Atlases used to be physical books. They're actually beautiful books. I have a copy of the second Maritimes Atlas, and it's gorgeous. But that isn't the way that we're doing them now. Now we are doing them as online atlases, which is great because where people had to buy the books and they were quite expensive, this way atlases are accessible to everyone, and they are interactive. So obviously this is the website for the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas, which was done between 2010 and 2014. So it was one of our first online atlases. And can anybody, just out of curiosity, tell me what the owl on the top there is? You know, just to throw in a little species trivia or quiz here. Anyone attend the owl webinar and remember what this guy is? Okay, we've got a short-eared, boreal. Any other thoughts? It is indeed a boreal owl. So it's got that nice ivory bill, and then it's got the black borders, but it is broken up by these white spots, and it's got polka dots on its forehead. So you are right, it is a boreal owl. Okay, so the core of an online breeding bird atlas is these species accounts, and there's one for every single bird that was found breeding in the province during the atlas. So this is for the bobolink, which we do indeed have here. It's one of our listed species. And each of these species accounts consists of a picture, usually taken by an atlaser, a little bit of a write-up about the species, so characteristics of it, its range, the habitat it likes, and then what we're really after are these maps that you can see under the picture there. And specifically, we are looking to build these two maps. The first one on the left there is the distribution map. So in each of these little colored squares, bobolinks were observed. You can see that the different colors, you may not be able to see actually because it's quite tiny, but the different colors correspond to different levels of confidence that they were breeding there. And we're going to be talking about breeding evidence and how it's used to sort of decide whether we're really confident something is breeding in an area or it's just possible. And then the second map here is the relative abundance. So on the left, you see everywhere bobolinks were seen. But then on the right, you see where the most bobolinks were seen. And you can tell that if you want to hedge your bets and have the highest chance of seeing a bobolink, you would kind of go to the southern interlake region, sort of right between Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg. The other thing that's really cool about an online breeding bird atlas, and I think maybe this is possibly my favorite feature. So you couldn't do this with the paper atlases, but here you can now search by location. So let's say I were lucky enough to be planning a trip to Churchill, Manitoba, and I wanted to know what bird species I might see there. I can figure out what square Churchill, Manitoba is in, and I can enter that square into the atlas, and it will come up with a summary list for the square. So it'll tell me all the bird species that were seen there and what breeding evidence was associated with them. And so that's a really, really neat tool to have if you're planning a trip somewhere and want to know what you might see. We do breeding bird atlases all across Canada. So Birds Canada has been involved in leading atlases in just about every Canadian province now. And obviously the data from these different bird atlases can be combined. So this is a distribution map for rusty blackbirds all across Canada. So it contains data from the BC Breeding Bird Atlas, the Saskatchewan Atlas, Manitoba Atlas, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. You will notice, however, that apparently rusty blackbirds stop breeding in a very straight line across the middle of Quebec and don't breed here in Newfoundland, which is obviously not the case, since they were one of our species at risk from last week. And of course, this brings us to the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. So as is often the case, Newfoundland is the last province here. So we're the only province that currently lacks a modern bird atlas. And obviously, when we're trying to construct maps like that one for the rusty blackbird, it's a bit of a gap in our understanding of the status and the distribution of birds at a national level. It's also really important to do this atlas because, as we've discussed a lot, Newfoundland is really important for birds. So we have some of the largest and most important seabird colonies in the world, like our Leach's storm petrel colony at Baccalieu, which is the largest in the world. We also have the largest colony of Atlantic puffins in North America. And we have unique subspecies of birds, so like the gray-cheeked thrush and the red crossbill. And we're also an island that is likely to experience significant impacts of climate change. And that can result in range shifts for species like the boreal owl and the Canada jay. So it's really important for us to establish a baseline of species distribution and abundance now, which will allow us to monitor changes in the future. I've alluded a couple of times to the fact that the Breeding Bird Atlas is a huge project. It is a massive collaborative effort. So Birds Canada is leading this atlas, but in partnership with all of the organizations you see at the top of the screen there. And our most important partner is, of course, citizen scientists. So people like you. The Atlas relies very heavily on volunteer birders going out to observe birds and submitting their observations to our online database. So I'm going to tell you how you go about doing that if you're interested in doing so. So as I said, the goal of our atlas is to map the distribution and abundance of Newfoundland's breeding birds. And the timing is actually a little bit more up in the air than it would appear. So originally, our 5 years were the summer of 2020 to the summer of 2024, which would make this upcoming summer our last data collection summer. You may remember just a minor world event that happened in 2020. It turns out launching a citizen science project in the middle of a pandemic is a bit of a tricky thing to do. And so we may end up extending our atlas by another season, but we're really not sure yet. So we are going into this summer like it's going to be our last data collection summer. Our peak season is the 7th of June to the 7th of July. However, it's important to note that we accept observations of breeding birds anytime. So for example, owls breed much earlier. That's why we do the owl survey right now. Canada jays breed very much earlier. Birds like cedar waxwings and American goldfinches breed in August. And so there is a lot of variability in bird breeding seasons, and we do accept breeding observations year-round. However, the majority of species kind of hit their peak of breeding between the 7th of June and the 7th of July. So that's our focal season. So how do you atlas for birds, especially on an island the size of Newfoundland? There is a geographic framework that we work with. So the island of Newfoundland has been divided into 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer squares, of which there are 1,485 in total. And in case you're wondering, yes, I do see that number when I close my eyes. I think about it a lot. It's kind of a scary number. We've grouped those squares into 8 regions, which you can see there. The astute observer may notice that one of those regions is not, in fact, in Newfoundland at all. So our region 8 is the islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon, which are, of course, French islands. We were there last summer telling people about the atlas, and we're hoping that they will be able to collect data for us there this summer. And that'll make our atlas pretty unique because I think it'll be the only North American international atlas, which is very cool. The other thing that you'll see when you look at this map is that nice little cross-hatching of black dots and white dots, or hollow dots. And what those indicate are priority squares. There is nothing innately special about our priority squares. We didn't pick places that we knew there were lots of birds or anything like that. You can see by looking at the map that we've actually done it in a very systematic way. So 1 in every 4 squares is a priority 1 square, which are the black squares, and then roughly 1 in every 4 squares is a priority 2 squares, which are those hollow squares, outline circles, sorry. And so what we're really hoping for there is to try and distribute coverage. So we didn't want a situation where, say, all the squares in the Codroy Valley and on the Avalon Peninsula were done, but then no squares across the rest of the island were done. Now, there is naturally a little bit of bunching, but we're hoping that if people have to decide between 4 different squares, they will put their effort into the priority squares, and will ensure that we collect data over a reasonably wide range. So what types of data can you collect? There are 3 that we're going to talk about today. There are incidental observations, general atlasing, and point counts. And they're all quite different and require a different level of involvement with the atlas. So the first is incidental observations, and really anyone can submit those. This is any bird, anywhere. Basically, it's birds you notice when you are out doing non-birding activities. So let's say you're driving along and you happen to notice a Canada goose with goslings, or a loon with a baby on its back. You can enter those data into the atlas. All we need to know are where you were, what time it was, so date and time of day, what you saw, and the number of them, and then what it was doing. So that's what we need to know. So anybody can enter incidental observations. It really doesn't require much of a commitment to the atlas at all. You have to create an account, but otherwise That's really all you need to do. The primary time for incidental observations is late May to mid-August, and that's just because that's when most of our birds are here. But for example, a lot of people have told me about owls they've seen in particular places, and that's great incidental observations. So we would really like that information submitted to the atlas. Incidental observations provide us with presence data. So they tell us that a species is there, but it doesn't tell us anything about whether a species is in the surrounding squares. So basically, to do that, we need to get at general atlasing. This is how we get presence absence data. And so this is basically a search of one of those 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer area atlas squares that we talked about. And how do you search 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer area? It's tricky, for sure. We don't expect you to document every blade of grass in the square, but really what we're looking for is an amount of time spent in the square. So we generally consider that if 12 to 20 hours have been spent birding in the square, then that square is probably complete. You've probably picked up most of what there is to find there. This also primarily happens from late May to mid-August, but the plus here is that it provides us with presence and absence information. So if you spend 20 hours in a square and you don't see or hear any common loons, for example, then it's maybe not that likely that common loons are there. So because this is associated with a measure of effort, it does provide us absence information. So these square maps you can get from our website for every single square on the island of Newfoundland, and they're great because they show you where the roads are in the square, but they also give you an idea of what the distribution of habitat is in the square. So those different colors indicate different types of habitat. So the pink here is shrubland, and then the various greens demonstrate different kinds of forest. So broadleaf, coniferous, and mixedwood forest. And ideally, when you're surveying a square, we would like you to spend a proportional amount of time in each habitat type. So if you were, for example, surveying this square, you would probably want to spend about 40% of your time in broadleaf forest and 10 to 15% of your time in shrubland. Now, I'm going to say I'm going to add a couple of sort of reality checks to that. The first is that we are very aware that in Newfoundland, it is often quite difficult to bushwhack. We have many years of experience behind us to say this. So we don't necessarily expect you to get out there and survey all of that off-road habitat and make sure that you spend 40% of your time in the broadleaf forest. A lot of the time when we're surveying, we're doing a lot of walking of roads and trails because honestly, by the time you bushwhack your way into the middle of a patch of coniferous forest, at least if you're me, you've probably scared every bird for a kilometer around. And so when you stand there, you don't actually hear much of anything. The other thing I will say is that our habitat maps were created using GIS layers that were quite old and not necessarily accurate. So for example, this square shows an awful lot of broadleaf forest. It may very much be overestimating the amount of broadleaf forest. It's not incredibly typical to find broadleaf forest, so we may not have that right, and that's okay. That's another reason that we're not being incredibly fussy about having people spend, 50% of their time in broadleaf forest and 10% in shrubland and that kind of thing. So square assignments. The first thing that I will say is that you do not need to sign up for a square. Basically, way back at the beginning of the Atlas, we were trying to have people sign up for a square so that we could try and distribute the effort again across the province. So when you sign up for Square, it means that you are committing to completing those 12 to 20 hours of general atlasing. In 2020, it meant that you were committing to complete that over a 5-year period. Now it would mean that you are committing to complete it over this summer or hopefully over the next 2 summers. So it's not as onerous a commitment as it might seem. It certainly does not mean that you can only submit data from that one square that you are assigned to. And it doesn't mean that others can't submit data from your square. So it's basically just a commitment to help us finish the square. And they help us organize the effort and kind of figure out where to direct our Atlas team, but it's certainly not a requirement. If you are, however, interested in signing up for a particular square, you would get in touch with the regional coordinators. So for each of those 8 regions that we showed you, we have a volunteer regional coordinator, and that coordinator knows what needs to be covered in that square and can help you figure out which square to take on and how to get access to it and that kind of thing. And the names and contact information for all of our regional coordinators are listed on our Atlas website. Okay, and then there's the last kind of data, and this is point counts, which are basically exactly what they sound like. So during a point count, you stand at a predetermined location and you record all of the birds that you see and hear during a specific time period. So in our case, that time period is 5 minutes. And point counts are really important for allowing us to generate the abundance map. So the second map that I showed you. Because they tell us how many of a species are in a given area. But they do require a more specialized protocol and skill set. And this is because most birds, as we've said several times during this series, are actually more often heard than seen. And so it does necessitate the ability to recognize pretty much all of the birds we have here by ear. So you need to know what they are without seeing them. And this is done also in a shorter time window. So these surveys are actually only done between the 7th of June to the 7th of July, because this is when most of our species are the most vocal. And they need to be done between half an hour before sunrise to 4.5 hours after sunrise. So they are a very early morning type of survey. Now, how do you know where to do point counts? We go back to these nice Atlas square maps that you can get from the website. So for each square, to call it complete, we are looking for a total of 15 point counts. And a certain number of those point counts will be on road or predetermined, and then the rest of them will be off road. So essentially, the number of predetermined point counts depends on how well the road in the square covers all of the different habitat types. So for this square, you can see that we want 10 predetermined point counts and 5 off-road point counts. So for the 10 predetermined point counts, you would take numbers 1 through 10, and the coordinates are actually provided on the sheet there. Now, if, for example, you were doing this and you found that, just seeing, let's say 0.9 is on a curve there and there's no safe place to stop, you would then take out 0.9 and add in 0.11. So essentially you do the first 10 points here, unless one of them is unsafe or inaccessible, and then you just move on to the next one. Your 5 off-road point counts, the type of habitat that they're placed in is determined by the habitat map. So you can see there, under number of off-road point counts, it's saying that it wants 4 in wetland and 1 on barren. And if you look at it, off the top of my head, I don't actually see where they want the, oh, I see the barrens, they're on the side of the pond there. But you can see that there's a whole bunch of wetland, which is that whitish color, that is not covered by the road. So if you only sampled on the road there, you'd have almost no samples of wetlands, even though they make up a lot of the square. And so that's why you're being directed to sample points in the wetlands. And ideally what you do is pick a spot in the wetland before you went out into the square that day. So when you're doing off-road point counts, you want to be really careful not to pick spots where you hear interesting birds singing, because once you do that, it's not a representative sample. So you usually pick the spot ahead of time and then try and make your way out to that spot when you go out to do the point counts. So that's all I'm really going to say about point counts, but if anyone wants more information or to know how to choose those off-road locations, I'm happy to chat about it. So I did say that point counts require a very specialized set of skills, and they do. But if you're not comfortable identifying birds by ear, you can still contribute to point count data collection. And we're certainly looking for your help. And you can do that through bioacoustics. So basically collecting bird survey data through audio recordings. So the Atlas office has, I think, about now 12 of these little handheld Zoom recorders, which you can see sitting on a tripod there with a nice little windscreen hat on. That's my Zoom recorder. His name is Atticus. And he's gone everywhere with me for the past 3 summers because I have also been learning my bird song here, and I was not confident in my ability to identify birds by ear. So this has definitely been a learning journey for me. And I found it a lot of fun to take the recorder out and see what I can hear and then play the recordings back and see what I missed and learn that way. So basically, this would work exactly the same way as the point count. You take it out to those pre-designated points, you set it up, you hit record, you say what day it is, where you are, and then you just record your 5 minutes of bird song, and then submit your recordings at the end of the summer to the Atlas office, and we will analyze those recordings for you. And it'll be just as effective as collecting data in person. They're also just a lot of fun to have in the field. This is Atticus roasting a hot dog with us. There are instructions on setup and collecting data with these guys available on the website. So if you would like to use a Zoom recorder, please let me know and we will arrange to get one to you. And just make sure to read the instructions on the setup and how to collect data before you go in the field, because we have unfortunately had some cases where people, for example, forgot to say where they were, and then we aren't able to use the recording. So if you're going to put all that effort into collecting the data, we would like to be able to use it. Okay, we're getting to the breeding evidence, which I've been promising since the beginning of this presentation. So we're not interested in just which bird species you see, we are also interested in what they're doing. So the Atlas is really cool because there's a focus on behavioral data. With each bird observation, you also provide a breeding evidence code. And an observation is actually only useful to the Atlas when we can associate it with the probability that a bird is breeding there. So the breeding evidence code is really, really important information. We have a predetermined list of breeding evidence codes. So when most people think, how do we know for sure that a bird is breeding somewhere? They think about finding a nest, which takes a lot of time and can often be a very great source of disturbance to the bird. So that's not really what we're asking people to do. We've got this nice standardized set of breeding codes, which we will go through now with examples. They seem really simple, but I warn you now, this is what today's quiz is about, and they're trickier than you think sometimes. So the first code is X. So a species is observed, but not in suitable breeding habitat. And this isn't really used that often because most species during the breeding season are in suitable breeding habitat. But a really good example would be this ring-billed gull, which, believe it or not, does not breed in a McDonald's parking lot, even though that is where you see them an awful lot of the time. So this would get an X. It's important to note here that migratory birds, things that you think are migrating through, should not get an X. So a prerequisite for an X is that it is during the bird's breeding season, not while it's on migration. So your next question might be, well, how do you know if it's the bird's breeding season? And you can find the answers to that on our website. So Jenna very carefully put together a table of expected breeding dates for Newfoundland for all of our species. And so the blue shading you can see there tells us when we expect that species to breed here in Newfoundland. Now, there is a little wiggle room on either side because we often don't have great data for Newfoundland, and that's something that we're actually hoping that the Atlas will help us narrow down a little bit. But it should give you a general sense of when things are breeding versus when they're likely migrating through. The other thing I'll mention is we do have an app for entering data, and when you enter data through the Nature Counts app on your phone, it will also tell you what the expected breeding dates are for Newfoundland. Okay, so X is not really any breeding evidence at all, but now we get into our possible breeding codes. And the lowest one is an H, so species observed in suitable nesting habitat during their breeding season. So for example, here we have this black-throated green warbler. It's in a nice deciduous forest. That is its breeding habitat. It would get an H, possible breeding. However, if that black-throated green warbler was singing, it would get an S. So this is a male or an adult producing sounds associated with breeding. So that is singing, but not calling. So remember that singing and calling are different things for many species, well, for all species. And it also applies to some sounds that we would not say are songs at all, but are sort of display sounds. So if you were at the OWL webinar, I talked a lot about the winnowing of Wilson snipe, the sound that they make during their display dives, which sounds an awful lot like a boreal owl call. That would get an S because even though it's not a song, it's not being produced vocally, it is a sound associated with breeding. So it is something that is made to attract females. So our example here is this May bay-breasted warbler, and it's obviously singing its little heart out during the breeding season. So now we've moved from our possible codes to our probable codes. And the first probable code is M. So this is multiple singing, calling, or drumming individuals. So multiple individuals being vocal in one visit to a single square in suitable habitat during the species breeding season. So let's say I'm at Cape St. Mary's and there are 8 male savanna sparrows singing in the breeding season, and I hear them all on one visit. Well, chances are at least one of those 8 birds is breeding, so that would get an M. The next one is P, and this is for a pair observed in suitable nesting habitat during the species breeding season. Here you do need to be able to tell the difference between males and females. So just 2 individuals hanging out together couldn't be declared a pair unless you can actually tell that one is male and one is female. So our example here is our Barrow's golden eye pair. You can very clearly see that one is male and one is female, and they are together in suitable habitat during the breeding season. So we would give them a P for probable, and that would be for pair probable breeding. Another probable breeding code is territory. And this is a bit of a tricky one because it requires multiple visits. And the 2 visits have to be 1 week or more apart. But if over the course of a week or over the course of a month, you go back multiple times and you find an individual singing or drumming or displaying in the same spot each time or close to the same spot, chances are that this bird is defending a territory, it's invested in that area, and it is staying there. So at that point, you would give it a T. You don't use it for colonial birds or for species that might forage or loaf a long distance from their nesting site. Okay, so our next probable code is a display. And I, at the beginning, was very confused by why something like a ruffed grouse drumming or a Wilson snipe diving didn't count as a display. So the important thing about this is that you need 2 birds before you can give it a D code. So you're looking for interactions between 2 birds that indicate breeding. So if, for example, a male is displaying in front of a female and you can see both birds, then it would get a D. Or, and I think this is probably the more often seen behavior, if you see birds chasing each other. So 2 males chasing each other, 2 females chasing each other, male chasing a female, then that would be a D because it is an antagonistic behavior that suggests breeding. So our example here is our spruce grouse, and it's displaying to a female. Now, if I just saw this spruce grouse, I would not be able to give it a D, but if there's a second spruce grouse there, I would be able to. Our next probable code is V, and that's a bird visiting a probable nest site in suitable nesting habitat during the breeding season. So for example, here's our little black-capped chickadee. We know that they are cavity nesters, and it's going in and out of this cavity in April. But then let's say I don't see it again. However, it was checking out when I know is its breeding habitat during the breeding season, so it would get a V for probable breeding. Our next code is one that we use quite a bit here in Newfoundland, and that is A for agitated behavior or alarm calls of an adult. And I love this example because this is the one we hear all the time. Greater yellowlegs, alarm calling often from the top of a tree. They look very silly standing at the top of trees, but they don't seem to be worried about that. And these guys will just call and call and call at you as you tromp through, like a kilometer of bog. They'll just keep alarm calling at you. So clearly they are agitated. They have chicks somewhere in that bog. This is one that we very rarely use because the brood patch or cloacal protuberance actually requires that you have a bird in your hand. So this is mostly for people who band and catch birds. But both of those are indicators of breeding. So females will get, or sorry, I should say the bird that incubates the eggs will get what's called a brood patch. So lose its feathers and become highly vascularized where it touches the eggs to keep them warm. And then male birds will store sperm in their cloaca, so it will actually protrude a little bit during the breeding season. You probably won't use this one. This is, by the way, a bank swallow, and that's a very clear brood patch. And then I think this is our last probable code, and this is N. So nest building by wrens or nest hole excavation by woodpeckers. Just those two groups. And that is because both woodpeckers and wrens will build dummy nests or roosting nests. So they'll actually use more holes than they, or make more holes than they actually intend to use. So just seeing them making a hole is not enough to confirm breeding. So here we have our downy woodpecker excavating a cavity, but we don't know for sure if it's going to nest there. Okay, now we're moving on to our confirmed codes. And you'll notice now that we've moved to the confirmed codes that they are 2-letter codes. So any code with 2 letters is confirmed breeding. So NB is the first one, and that's nest building by anything except wrens and woodpeckers, and that includes carrying nesting material. So here we have this lovely purple finch female with her beak full of grasses. And so she's building a nest. I don't need to know exactly where that nest is to know that she is nesting nearby. Another confirmed breeding code is the distraction display. So some of you may remember from our webinar about shorebirds that they will often fake an injury or display to attempt to draw attention from the nest or the young. So here we have a killdeer doing a broken wing display. And again, we don't need to see the young to know that they are nearby. There's no other reason for this behavior, so that would also be confirmed breeding. Another one is NU, which means an empty, used nest or identifiable eggshells from earlier the same nesting season. And this is one that we use with caution. And that is for a couple of reasons. Many eggshells and also nests are difficult to identify to species just by the nest. And it's also often difficult to tell if they are from that nesting season or the earlier nesting season. So for example here, this is a chipping sparrow used nest. This was in Alberta. But the only reason that I know that it was a chipping sparrow used nest is because I was there the day before. I saw the baby chipping sparrows in it, and then I came back the next day and they were gone. So in this case, I'm absolutely sure that it is a chipping sparrow nest and that it is from this season. If you can't be sure of these things, then you probably don't want to use the code. Okay, next confirmed breeding code is recently fledged young. So altricial young, that will be birds that are born with their eyes closed, all naked and totally helpless in the nest and grow up there, and then they eventually fledge from the nest, but they don't fly very far. Or downy young for precocial young. So things like shorebirds, their young will leave the nest almost immediately, but they are also not capable of sustained flight. So you're probably wondering why it matters that this individual is not capable of sustained flight. And it's because when we're doing atlasing, we don't just want to know that the species was breeding, we want to be able to tie that breeding to a specific location. So we want to know that the breeding happened in that square. And so when you have young, for example, let's say juvenile bald eagles that are capable of flying long distances, you don't know for sure that that breeding, that bird was hatched in the square that you're in. And so that's why we really focus on guys like this. This is a little horned lark, and you can tell that he is a recent fledgling. And there are a few things that give that away. His feathers are very clean and fresh. He's kind of fluffy looking. And if you look at the edge of his bill, he's still got the remnants of the gape. So that's the edging of the mouth on baby birds that makes their open mouths particularly obvious. So this guy is not going to be flying very far. And you could probably also tell that if you walked up to him because he wouldn't go very far. And so we can give him an FY for confirmed breeding in the square. We have just a few more breeding evidence codes. So AE, an adult entering, occupying, or leaving a nest site. So for example here, if you saw that American robin fly down into that nest and then you saw the little head poking out, you would give that bird an AE. And obviously this is confirmed breeding. So there is a nest and it is occupied. FS is an adult carrying a fecal sac. So when lots of young altricial birds are born, they actually produce these little fecal sacs. So they produce their waste in these little gelatinous sacs, which the adults will pick up and fly away from the nest. It keeps the nest sanitary, and they don't want to drop them right near the nest to attract predators. So if you are to see something like a female red-winged blackbird carrying a fecal sac, that is also confirmed breeding. This one I have to say is my absolute favorite. This is CF, an adult carrying food for young. No matter how many times I see it in the field, I just think it is wonderful to see. And you can see here we have a little Wilson's warbler with a mouth full of bugs. And there is no reason for that bird to be carrying food unless it has nestlings nearby. And then, of course, our last couple of levels of breeding evidence are the really, really incontrovertible evidence of breeding. So if you find a nest containing eggs, like this American pipit nest, that is obviously confirmed breeding. And if you find a nest with young, seen, or in the case of woodpeckers and chickadees, you're more likely to hear them than you are to see them. So these are northern flicker nestlings. I think that was in Dildo Run Provincial Park. That is, of course, NY confirmed breeding. Okay, so whirlwind tour through the breeding codes, but that actually brings us to our quiz for tonight. And then we have a little bit more after, but not too much. So Jenna, I'm going to get you to help me run the quiz again, because as we know, you have to launch it for some reason. So if you could launch our first quiz. First of all, what species do we have here? Just answers in the chat. What have we got? Come on, you guys definitely know this one. He's a little spotty looking. Yes, he is a robin, an American robin, a very, very grumpy young American robin that Jenna and I saw in the field a few years ago. So let's say you're out in the field and you see this young American robin hopping around, barely able to fly on a lawn. What would you say the correct breeding code is? All right, just about everyone's answered. And just about everyone agrees. Well, actually, everyone who's answered does agree. So if I share the results, can you see them, or does Jenna have to do it?
I think I might have to do it. I just did, so hopefully everyone can see it now.
Okay, so you are correct. Here we have an FY, recently fledged or downy young. So this little robin is not going very far. And in fact, as I recall, mostly what he was doing was turning over rocks looking for food and looking very grumpy that he couldn't eat rocks. Okay, so what about this guy? First of all, what species do we have here? Oh, never mind. Jenna's given us the answer. Jenna.
Sorry, I was already pressing it when you asked.
All right. Okay, so it's a barn swallow. Jenna's giving it away. So if you see a barn swallow flying into a barn, what would you think the appropriate breeding code is? Interesting. We've got a solid split at the moment. Any more answers? All right. Okay, Jenny, you want to share the answers? So this one is a little bit trickier. And you can see that we had all 4 different answers there. The correct answer is B, visiting a probable nest site. So it is in breeding season in suitable habitat. So at the very least, you could definitely give it an H. But we know that barn swallows nest pretty much exclusively in human-made structures like barns. And so we would give this guy a V for visiting a probable nest site. We wouldn't give it an AE, although I can definitely see why you would think we might. But unless we can actually see the nest, we could not give it an AE. Okay, we only have 5 questions today. So first of all, anyone remember what species we have here? Guesses in the chat? Jenna, don't put up the questions yet. Nice, you guys are on the ducks. So you are indeed correct. We have common mergansers here. So let's say we see this pair of common mergansers copulating during spring migration. What code would we give it? Or them, sorry, there are 2 of them. Okay, any other answers? All right, Jenna, you want to share? Okay, so this is actually kind of a trick question. Some people thought pair, some people thought courtship or display, and in fact, in other circumstances, you would probably call it courtship or display because it is an interaction between 2 individuals. You can clearly tell males and females. However, ducks in particular are tricky because they tend to pair up long before they reach their breeding grounds. And so the keywords in this question are during spring migration. So this implies that it is not actually yet in the breeding season. And so we wouldn't even give it an X. Now, where things get complicated is often migration period and breeding season do overlap a little bit. And during that overlap, it can be very, very hard to tell. But if this is early in the spring, chances are those mergansers are already paired up, but that they're not breeding here. Okay, 2 more questions. First of all, anybody remember what we've got here? I think I've scared Jenna into not sharing the questions yet, so. Agreement that it is a wren. You are indeed correct. It's got that really characteristic upright tail, very wren-like. We really only have 1 breeding species of wren here on the island, and that is the winter wren. So this little guy is a winter wren. And if we were to see this winter wren carrying twigs and hair into a nest box, so these guys will happily nest in boxes, what code would we give it? All right. So Jenna, do you want to share the answers? A little bit of a trick question again. This would only get an N, not an NB, because it is a wren, and wrens will in fact build these dummy nests. So we know that it is building something, but we don't know whether it's actually going to lay eggs there. So we get an N for this guy. And our last question. All right. what is this guy before we start? Besides molting, you can definitely see he's losing some of his feathers, but what species do we have here? This is the kind of bird that I have decided to start calling a craven, because it's either a crow or a raven and it drives me nuts trying to tell the difference. But we've got some pretty solid crows coming in here. Is anyone on the side of the raven? All right, you are correct. It is a crow, and we can tell that by the shape of its tail, that nice fan-shaped tail instead of a diamond-shaped tail. So well done. Okay, so if we see a crow flying with food in its bill in May, what code would we give it? Okay, any more answers? Got one more. Okay, Jenna, you want to share the answers? So we've got a pretty solid split here as well. 3 of you thought adult carrying food for young. Somebody thought it could be courtship feeding. I can definitely see why you think that. You had no reason not to think that. So those of you who said H and X were clearly wary of my trick questions, and you were indeed correct. So some birds, like American crows, will carry food not just for their nestlings or even for courtship feeding. They'll carry food for themselves. So they'll pick up food and carry it elsewhere to consume it. And so the right answer for this one is actually H. It's May, so it's breeding season. Pretty much everywhere is suitable breeding habitat for crows. They're not too fussy, but that's the best we can give it because we don't know whether it's carrying food for itself or for its young. Okay, and so that actually brings us really nicely to the various sort of snag codes that will come up. And there are 2 different kinds. There's first invalid codes, which when you try and enter them, the system will just not accept them. So for example, birds like brown-headed cowbirds, they are nest parasites. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests. So if you were to say that you saw a brown-headed cowbird nest building, the system would say, I don't think so. And then our second kind of questionable code is an improbable code. And that means that you will be allowed to enter it, but the computer or the app on your phone will give you a warning. Doesn't mean it could never happen, but it will give you a warning. So NU, that used nest or eggshell code, the computer will always ask you whether you're sure that in fact you know what species it is, basically. And then CF for some species, like the American crow, if we don't know whether the species is carrying food for its young or if it's carrying food for courtship, it will give you a warning. That's one of the really nice things about using the app in the field, because when you when you enter the species plus the code, it will tell you if it thinks it's a questionable or an incorrect code. Few other quick notes about atlasing. There are some species for which we want more information, and these are our rare and colonial species. So anything under our Species at Risk Act or the Endangered Species Act in Newfoundland, we need to know a little bit more about them, specifically exactly where you saw them. So you need to take coordinates for them. And then for colonials, we need to know the number of individuals that you're seeing, and that's only for confirmed breeding records. And so things we're looking for there is a description of the bird or the colony, habitat, familiarity with the species, the location, whether anybody else saw it, and if you can, take photos and make recordings. So I just kind of wanted to bring us back to this because this is what we are aiming to make. We are aiming to make a map like this for all of our species that breed here in the province. And obviously that's a lot of work. So I also wanted to briefly touch on why we do it. And I think one of the really, really big benefits of atlases is what I was talking about at the beginning with the gray-cheeked thrush. They are a really good way to monitor and evaluate species and ecosystem health. So they're good to know about what's going on with bird populations, but birds are also really good indicators of what's going on with the ecosystem as a whole. That's because they are ubiquitous. We find them all over the place. They are visible, and they're relatively easy to monitor. And because so many people are interested in birds, we can do this as a citizen science project, which makes it cost effective. Atlases are also scientifically rigorous, and they are repeatable. So they are designed to be repeated every 20 years. And that means we can keep track of what's going on with bird populations over time. And so I have some examples here from the first and second Maritimes breeding bird atlases. So the first one was done in 1986 to 1990, and the second one was done in 2006 to 2010. And so the map that you see there on the left is the probability of observation for barn swallows during the first atlas, and in the middle, the probability of observation for barn swallows during the second atlas. And the third map shows you the difference, but you don't really need that third map to see that the probability of observation for barn swallows in the second atlas was significantly reduced. So you can see that decline in species very clearly there. And sometimes we also pick up the opposite trend. So this is for blue-headed vireos. And again, you've got the probability of observation during the first and second atlases, and you can see that their populations appear to be growing. So we're seeing many, many more blue-headed vireos. And besides keeping track of what's going on with species, we want the atlas to be used as a conservation tool to inform public policy and influence decisions at multiple scales. So we need to know where things are and what we have in order to be able to make smart decisions about land use. So this is information for conservation organizations, information for the government, information for industry, so that we know what's out there and where it is. And then, of course, the other thing about atlases is they're a really great way to get people outside and enthused about birds. So one of our goals is to grow the birding population here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that's part of our goal with this series that we're doing. We really want people to get involved in this project because it's a lot of fun and you really don't have to be an expert. And so just to kind of demonstrate that, this is our species map for the American robin there in the photo. Now this I think was last year, so we have updated it a little bit, but you can see that there are plenty of places on this island where we have no breeding evidence for robins. Does that mean robins aren't breeding there? Nope, it just means we haven't gotten there yet. Nobody has reported them. So even if the only thing you recognize is a robin, but it's building a nest outside your cabin door, that is information that we want to have. And I just have another map here for the horned lark. So horned larks tend to nest in coastal barren areas away from people, but they're not an uncommon bird. But if you look at our map for horned larks, it suggests that they are really not around very much. So I know that we can improve that map. So as I said, we're 4 years into this atlas. This may or may not be our last breeding season to collect evidence. And you can see this map shows our hours of survey effort, with the blue being 20 plus hours, and then the yellow being squares where more effort is needed to call them complete. We've really done, honestly, the Newfoundland volunteers have been fantastic. We have pretty amazing coverage, but we have a lot of yellow squares in there where we really need to finish off the hours so that we can call them done. And we have a lot of white squares where we haven't collected information yet. And then this, I keep telling them, oh, sorry, this says 3 years in. This is actually 4 years in. So this is a map as of January. This shows the total number of species detected. We really need to change our colors on this map because all of those gray squares are just between 1 and 33 species detected. They're not where no species are. But I think the interesting thing here is 182 species have been reported for Newfoundland overall. And that is through over 10,000 checklists. So every time you go out birding as an atlaser, you submit what's called a checklist. And so far we've collected over 10,000 of those. So it's a really cool project, and I am so impressed with what our 235 volunteers have been able to do. If you're interested in joining us for this next year. You can find our website here, nfbirdatlas.ca. And you'll notice right up there in the corner, it's very difficult to read on the light blue, but it says login. If you click that, it will, perhaps somewhat confusingly, take you to another website. And this is our Nature Counts database website. So this is how we collect all of our information. So if you're coming there for the first time, you would sign up for the project. And once you've done that, you'll be able to access Atlas Square resources. So those are those square maps I'm talking about. You enter the square number and it'll pop up with the option to download a PDF map or download just the coordinates of the point counts. So you'll be able to kind of plan your atlasing based on this map. Final key points for atlasing. As I said, everybody can contribute. We really want your information, just as long as you only submit things that you were sure of. So if you're not sure what you saw, then don't submit it. Bird ethically, so remember not to disturb birds. And there is a whole page about what birding ethically means on our website. If you are accessing private land, which is not a huge problem here in Newfoundland, but we do sometimes, make sure you get permission. Be respectful of each other, of the birds, of landowners. Be safe. Tell somebody where you're going and have fun. It's actually a pretty fantastic way to spend the summer. And with your help, we can put Newfoundland's birds on the map. We can finish this atlas. So I will stop there, take any questions, and I will just say that next week is the last week of our webinar series. And Jenna will be teaching us about birding by ear, which is a really fun skill to have, and she is an expert at it.
Thanks, Catherine. You gave me a lot of credit. That was a really good presentation. I love hearing all the breeding evidence stuff. It's super fun. We had a question in the chat about how many species of birds are confirmed to nest in Newfoundland. And I counted them up quickly in our data summary. And it looks like we have 136 species that have confirmed level breeding across the island so far, which is pretty cool actually to see, because I haven't added that up yet myself.
No, that's really cool.
Yeah. And then Carol also asked if we have any strategies for getting young people into birding. And I mentioned that you've done quite a lot of school presentations. I don't know if you remember how many you've done off the top of your head. But I know the kids have been pretty interested, I think.
Yes. Although I did give a presentation to a school on Fogo Island last year where I think it was grade 4s or something. And I asked them what the most important tool for birding was, thinking that they would say binoculars, and they said a 12-gauge shotgun. So, different point of view.
a whole different perspective there, I guess.
I mean, the thing is, you will definitely be able to identify a bird after you shot it with a 12-gauge shotgun, but you won't be able to give us much breeding evidence.
True enough. Okay, I don't think we have any other questions. We have a couple of thank yous in chat, and yeah, so this has been great, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.
Yeah, see you all next week. Thank you for coming out tonight, especially with the late time. I appreciate it.